Is the layout and we're gonna go about today. So we have a discussion on the three-dimension anatomy of the basal ganglia. We see the input to the basal ganglia, the output from the basal ganglia, the intrinsic connection. Indeed, is the direct pathway of the intrinsic connection, and the indirect pathway and the yellow. And then in a later video, we'll have a separate video that we discuss about the nigrostriatal pathway and this clinical correlation. Parkinson's disease as one of the hypokinetic disorders, and Huntington disease as a representative of the hyperkinetic disorders. And got some questions for you. So if you've asked yourself, how does the brain choose what kind of movement to make, like what kind of movement to allow and which one to inhibit or to block? If you've asked yourself the role of dopamine in movement control, like what happens if someone has too much dopamine and what happens if someone has a little amount of dopamine, what movement disorders or disruption will be seen. And then do you know what happens when you're about to make a movement and you suddenly cancel that movement? Do you know what happens to the brain levels, to the individual neurotransmission, or to the individual pathways within the brain? And lastly, do you know the role of the basal ganglia in turning the habits into memory? Like you are doing something which becomes habitual, and then it comes to be automatic part of the memory within your brain. So follow me from the beginning of this video to the end, where I will get answers of these questions as we are moving along. So number one, let's discuss about the names. This name, the basal ganglia. So we know that the central nervous system is a nervous system. It's made up of individual neurons. The neurons are the the cells that make the central and the peripheral nervous system, or the nervous system in general. And we know that the neurons has got cell bodies and some projections, or we call them appendages. So this cell body has the nucleus, and then these extensions will have axons and dendrites. Now, the word ganglion, which is the single of the ganglia, it is specifically important. It is specifically meant for the correction of neuronal cell bodies, the cell body of these neurons that are outside the central nervous system. So that is what we call a ganglion, or a ganglia if we have to call them in a plural. And remember, the central nervous system will mean the brain and the spinal cord. And then we can have correction of these neuronal cell bodies that are within the central nervous system. And these now we'll call them the nucleus. But one among the most famous ganglion, for example, we have this dorsal root ganglion. So the dorsal root ganglion is it's a sensory ganglion that is found in the spinal root, we can say the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is a kind of mixed nerve. It has got the dorsal root and the ventral root. So this is the dorsal root, this is the ventral root. And the dorsal root now will have correction of neuronal cell bodies that is outside the central nervous system. Why? Because it's outside the brain and the spinal cord. This is the spinal cord, and it is outside the spinal cord. So it deserves to be called a ganglion, because it is outside the central nervous system. It qualifies to be called the ganglion. And then, as I have said, the correction of these neuronal cell bodies within the central nervous system will be called nucleus. Correction of neuronal cell bodies within the central nervous system, by that I mean within the brain or the spinal cord, we call them the nucleus. So we have this for one of the famous nuclei within the brain, and then you see because they gray matter that are found within the white matter. Initially we expected that this is the brain has got the major two layers, the outer layer, which is the gray matter, and the inner layer of the white matter. But we are surprised to have uh, gray matter within the white matter, gray matter within the white matter. And what we said is whenever you see the gray matter is collection of neuronal cell bodies, collection of neuronal cell bodies. But for this matter, these neuronal cell bodies are within the central nervous system, and this is why we call them nuclei. And no wonder that white matter is, the collection of myelinated fibers, the fibers with a myelin sheath, the fibers with a myelin sheath. So why are they called the basal ganglia? If and we know that they are within the central nervous system, they are within the brain. Then why then the basal ganglia? So, well, initially, previously, there was no distinction between the ganglion and the nucleus. Ganglion and the nucleus. So, ganglia and nuclei. There was no any distinction. Like people, the older terminology was the ganglion. So whether it was within the central nervous system or outside the central nervous system, the terminology that was used was the ganglion. And then, sometimes later, someone was clever enough to understand that there's a difference between the nucleus and ganglion. And that's when now those nuclei which were found within the brain or within the spinal cord, within the central nervous system, they like kind of changed the name from the ganglion to the nucleus, and then we had this nucleus ganglion distinction. But the basal ganglia, they were discovered before we had this distinction between the nucleus and the ganglion. This is why they are called ganglia, even though they are within the brain. But now, if we have to be correct, we would say the basal nuclei or the basal nuclei instead of the basal ganglia. But it also sounds nice when you say the basal ganglia instead of the basal nuclei, because it's kind of have bashed our brains, because our brains now they find it better when you say ganglion instead of the nucleus. But the appropriate terminology would be a nuclei. Now, so some of these nuclei, we discuss each one in detail, but we have the caudate nucleus, and we have the putamen here, we have the globus pallidus, we have subthalamic nucleus, substantia nigra, and one nucleus accumbens is not seen from this section, but we see it as we're moving. And just remember that these are the two lateral ventricles, so right lateral ventricle, left lateral ventricle, and this is the corpus callosum. This is a corpus callosum that connects different parts of the brain. And don't forget, I will also share a video on the the surface anatomy and the internal anatomy of the cerebral hemisphere, where we have discussed all these features. And then we have fibers here of the internal capsule. So the fibers of the internal capsule, they run in this direction. So these are the nuclei now, as I've said, but don't worry, we'll discuss each one in detail as we are moving. So something looks familiar here. Remember, a couple of videos ago, we discussed about the motor system, the organization of the motor system, and what we said is the cerebral cortex will give high order. I mean, it will give a command on, like, I want to make some kind of movement, and then this command will go to the basal ganglia. And we said if it's a game of musical notes, musical system is the brain lights the musical notes, and it gives these notes to the basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia now will translate that notes, or the musical note, and they will understand what kind of the movement the cerebral cortex has has to make. And then from now, the basal ganglia will choose what kind of movement to make, So what it does, the basal ganglia, it's selection of the movement and initiation. Now, after they have selected the movement, now they execute that movement. And if you remember, we said the function of cerebellum now was to proofread, to make it perfect, to make that movement perfect, to compare the information, the movement that has been made by the basal ganglia with the order that was given by the cerebral cortex. So it kinds of proofreads to like review what the movement that has been made by the basal ganglia. So today we're going to discuss about the basal ganglia. So among the most obvious function of the basal ganglia now is regulation of voluntary motor movement. No wonder, because it receives order from the cerebral cortex, and then it is translated initiate movement. So initiation and inhibition of movement is being done by the basal ganglia. Initiation and the inhibition of movement is being done by the basal ganglia. Then as we've said, turning habits into memory is also being done by the basal ganglia. So if you are doing something more frequently or too often, it becomes part of your memory, and this is why it is called the procedural memory, because the more you do, the more you gain. The more you do, the more you gain. And a very good example is manual gear transmission. Those people who are driving manual cars, the cars with manual gear transmission, they become even more perfect if they do it frequently, and then it becomes a part of the memory system. And this explains for why even these some drivers, like semi-trailer drivers, sometimes they even fall asleep while they're driving, but when it comes to the time to change gear from number 2 to number 3, for example, they do that without even awaking. So that is what we call the procedural memory. The more you do, the more it becomes even perfect. The more you do, the more it becomes even perfect. And then it has also a role in regulation of posture. So posture and muscle tone. Posture and muscle tone is also being controlled by the basal ganglia. Also emotions. Even though we know that the big part of the emotion is being done by the limbic system, but we have some contribution from the basal ganglia, and we see them as we are moving. But cognitive laws, we know the cognitive laws is the function of the forebrain, the frontal cortex, but we also have some contribution from part of the basal ganglia, and we see them as we move in. Also, the reward and motivation. Even though we know that the reward and motivation is highly being done by the limbic system, but as well we have some contribution from the basal ganglia. So let's discuss about this nuclei now. But before we discuss the nuclei, let's see the relationship that these nuclei have with adjacent structures. So we have said this is the lateral ventricles, and between two lateral ventricles there is a thin layer of membrane that separates between the two ventricles, and this is known as the septum pellucidum. The septum pellucidum is that thin layer of membrane that separates between the two ventricles. And what is this? The corpus callosum. And now this is the thalamus. And you see the relationship between this nucleus and the lateral ventricle. And then we say these are the fibers of the internal capsule. So this is the fibers of the internal capsule, and lastly this is the third ventricle. Now let's discuss about this nucleus. The nucleus number 1 is known as the caudate nucleus. we will see this caudate nucleus. It is called caudate because it has got a tail, and this tail will not be seen in this coronal section. But note the relationship between the caudate nucleus and the lateral ventricle. So the caudate nucleus and the lateral ventricle. So it is lateral to the lateral ventricle, lateral to the lateral ventricle. But we will see as we are moving. And then next is this nucleus here, which is known as the putamen. This is the putamen nucleus. The putamen nucleus, and the putamen nucleus has got an adjacent neighbor here, which is the globus pallidus. The globus pallidus is really translating to the peribodies, and is even you can notice the difference between these two. This is more darker, and this is a little bit paler. And we have another nucleus here, which is just below the thalamus. So this is the thalamus. This is below the thalamus. So it is known as subthalamic nucleus because it's below the thalamus. It's subthalamic nucleus. Why? Because it is below the thalamus. And we have this black nucleus here. You can guess the name already. That is substantia nigra. Substantia nigra, which translates into the black substance. So remember that the nucleus accumbens cannot be seen from this this view, and we have a special view that will reveal the nucleus accumbens as one of the subcortical structure. So these two nucleus here, the putamen and the globus pallidus, we will see that they will form a lens-like shape, the shape of a lens. And this shape of the lens, we call it the lentiform, but now we call the lentiform nucleus because these two are the nuclei. So these two nuclei, they form the shape of the lens, and now it translates into transforms to the lentiform nucleus. Now let us have a view on the corona of the horizontal section, the section horizontally. And we have two levels here. These levels, the section through the left hemisphere is at a different level from the section through the right hemisphere. Why? Because this is a little bit higher. If you can see, this section is a little bit higher and this is a little bit lower. So they are basically two different, they are all horizontal section, but through different levels of the brain. Now, what I want you to understand is that you remember we have this is the internal fiber, the fibers of the internal capsule. So the fibers of the internal capsule, and this is the caudate nucleus. Remember, I've told you that the caudate nucleus, it is called so because it has got a tail, and only we haven't seen that tail, but you will see it shortly. So it has got a tail. Now, so this will be the head of the this will be the head of the caudate nucleus, and the tail will be somewhere here. But don't worry, I will show you how we got this tail to be at a different place from the head. And then we have this will be the putamen, and this will be the globus pallidus, and it is paler when you compare to the putamen. And together the globus pallidus and the putamen, they form the shape of the lens. Now from this view we can see how this lentiform is formed. You can see it's a little bit like by convex shape. This is why it is called the lentiform nucleus, because it has a shape of the lens, and the shape of the lens is better appreciated on horizontal section. This is the fibers of the internal capsule, and this is the thalamus. And this is the lateral ventricles, as you can see here, the lateral ventricle on the left side and on the right side, and there was a thin layer of membrane that separated the two lateral ventricles, and we called them septum pellucidum. And remember the relationship between the caudate nucleus, the lateral ventricle, so it's lateral to lateral ventricle. But one of the most important things that you cannot forget is that the caudate nucleus and the thalamus, they are always medial to the fibers of the internal capsule. So this is the internal capsule, and thalamus and the caudate nucleus are always medial to the fibers of the internal capsule. And then on the other hand, putamen and globus pallidus, and together we call them the lentiform nucleus. They are always lateral to the fibers of the internal capsule. They are always lateral to the fibers of the internal capsule. This one you cannot forget. Now let's discuss the three-dimension anatomy of the basal ganglia. The three-dimension anatomy of the basal ganglia. So we have seen already. So sorry, before we discuss this three-dimension, I want you to add a terminology. I want you to add a terminology. Okay, don't worry. We have this terminology shortly. So we have already seen the coronal view through the basal ganglia. So this is the coronal view, and we know these structures. We know that we have the putamen and globus pallidus. Don't worry. And then let's go back to the lateral view. Let's go to the lateral view of the basal ganglia. So from the lateral view, this is what is seen, and remember. I've told you that the caudate nucleus is called so because it has got a tail, and this is the tail of the caudate nucleus. Don't worry about the caudate nucleus at this point. We'll discuss it shortly. And then this is putamen. And now the globus pallidus cannot be seen from this lateral view, but if we look in the anteromedial direction, we can see these are the globus pallidus, and we see that it has got two sections or two segments. The one which is external, which is near to the putamen, and the other one which is deeper, which is an internal capsule. So this is the external this is the external segment, and this is the internal segment of the globus pallidus. Internal segment of the globus pallidus. And then let's discuss each one in detail. So the caudate nucleus, now I'm repeating one more time. It is called the caudate because it has got a tail. Caudate, caudo. So it comes from the word caudo. And this is to emphasize that it possesses a tail, and this is the tail of the caudate nucleus. So the caudate nucleus has got the head here. This is the head of the caudate nucleus. And this is the body of the caudate nucleus, and this is the tail of the caudate nucleus. Please note that this yellowish structure here is the amygdala. It is not part of the caudate nucleus. The amygdala, even though it's connected to the caudate nucleus, but it forms part of the limbic system, and it will be discussed in a separate video. The amygdala is not part of the limbic, or is not part of the caudate nucleus. It is part of the limbic system, and you should have a separate video discussion. And then please note that the lateral ventricle the caudate nucleus, it is a C-shaped structure. So it is a C-shaped structure. It has a shape of C, and it joins the family of deep brain structures that will have C-shaped, which are the lateral ventricles and corpus callosum and the pharynx of the brain. So so here now this is the it's a C-shaped structure. And by doing so, it means it forms a constant relationship with the lateral ventricle. So this is the lateral ventricle, and remember from the two previous slides we have seen that it is lateral to the lateral ventricle. But I want you to note that it is the head of the caudate nucleus which is lateral to lateral ventricle, and as we are moving, the tail of the caudate nucleus will be medial to the lateral this part of the lateral ventricle. So this is the lateral. This whitish stuff here is lateral ventricle, and this bluish here is the corpus, is the caudate nucleus. So the head and body of the caudate nucleus are lateral to the this part of the um, to this part of the caudate of the lateral ventricle, but the tail, it is a little bit medial to the this inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. And so most of the fibers that are within the caudate nucleus, they utilizes GABA as the chief neurotransmitter. The chief neurotransmitter in the caudate nucleus will be GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid. But we have some, neurons within the caudate nucleus that will utilize acetylcholine, and it has motor functions, motor and behavioral function. The caudate nucleus has got motor and behavioral functions, and now can be classified that the head of the caudate nucleus will be more concerned with memory, cognitive and emotional function, and the tail of the caudate nucleus will be more associated with the visual information, particularly the visual discrimination. For you to detect the difference between two images. So for you to be able to describe the difference between two pictures or between two images, you need this visual discrimination intact. And the visual discrimination information is being processed partly by the tail of the caudate nucleus, which has got relationship with this lobe of the with this temporal lobe of the brain. So that is the visual discrimination. And if you have damage to this visual discrimination part of the caudate nucleus, for example, you will not be able to tell differences between two pictures or differences between two images. And as an example, we have two pictures here, and get yourself some few minutes, maybe 2 minutes, to mention the differences, 5 differences that are present between these two pictures. And if at all you cannot get these 5 differences, it means you might have a defect in your visual discrimination processing, and that is the tail of the caudate nucleus. And then let's discuss the relationship between the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So the caudate nucleus and the putamen are separated by the fibers of the internal capsule, as we have already seen. The fibers of the internal capsule will separate the caudate nucleus from the putamen. But these two nuclei remain reconnected back by some, fibers that communicate these two structures. So these, we call them the cellular bridges. So they bridge between the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So these are the bridges, the cellular bridges, as we can see. And these bridges now, this will turn these two nuclei, will form some form of striation. And this is why these two nuclei will be referred as the striatum. The striatum, or the neostriatum, is combination of the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Why? Because of this striation. So these two nuclei are very important. First of all, they have the same embryological origin, or they are embryologically associated. But also they kind of having the same histological structures. And we will see shortly that the caudate nucleus and the putamen, or the striatum, it forms the main input gate to the basal ganglia, the main input gate to the basal ganglia. So if you want to go through the basal ganglia, we first have to encounter the striatum, the caudate nucleus, and the putamen. But we also see that the nucleus accumbens is also associated with input to the basal ganglia, But the main input to the basal ganglia, I want you to notice this word, the main input to the basal ganglia will be done by the striatum, which is the caudate nucleus and putamen. Now, now the globus pallidus, as we have said, as its name suggests, they are peribodies. So they are peribodies as you compare the putamen. So this is a globus pallidus, this is putamen. This is a globus pallidus, this is putamen. And we have said the globus pallidus has got two segments, the external segment, the internal segment. So the external segment, the internal segment, and the internal segment of the globus pallidus, it is important in initiating and controlling movement. Yeah, so the external segment of the globus pallidus now is important in inhibiting unwanted movement. The internal segment is important in initiating and controlling movement. The external segment is important in inhibiting unwanted movements. For that matter, the external segment of the globus pallidus will be more seen on the indirect pathway of the basal ganglia, the indirect pathway. We'll see it shortly. And the internal segment now will be on the direct pathway, but will be there for both, but it forms one of the main output gate. So the output gate from the basal ganglia will be done by the internal segment of the globus pallidus, and we will see with also substantia nigra. Part of the substantia nigra will form the output from the basal ganglia. So the internal segment of the globus pallidus and the substantia nigra. The external segment of the globus pallidus, it is important in indirect pathway, and it forms it is inhibitory, which means it inhibits unwanted movement. Now, welcome to the this brackish stuff here. So as the name suggests, substantia nigra. So nigra, we have different ancient origin of the word nigra. So nigra, people from Spanish, I think Portuguese, somewhere they have these people, they call them negro, and from America, from States, they have these nigger. The niggers, they call themselves niggers because they are black, and so all these names translate into the blackish nature of this substance. So we call the substantia nigra, we translate into the black substance, and we saw it when we were discussing the brainstem. It is part of the brainstem, but it's also important in movement control, and we'll see. So it has got two components or two parts, which are substantia nigra pars compacta and substantia nigra pars reticulata. So substantia nigra pars compacta and substantia nigra pars reticulata. So the substantia nigra pars compacta, it is important because it helps in releasing dopamine. It helps in releasing dopamine, and the dopamine is very important neurotransmitter when it comes to the movement control. So it boosts the direct pathway and it suppresses the indirect pathway. We'll see it shortly while discussing the intrinsic connection of the basal ganglia. And by boosting the direct pathway, it will facilitate the movement. It facilitates movement initiation. It also has some role in reward and motivation. And then we have substantia nigra pars compacta. Remember, I've just told you that the internal segment of the basal gang of the globus pallidus is important output gate, the output gate of the from the basal ganglia system. As you're moving out from the basal ganglia system, the internal segment of the globus pallidus was one of the most important output gate. So this applies to the pars reticulata of the substantia nigra. So substantia nigra pars reticulata, it also forms the output gate from the basal ganglia system, the output gate from the basal ganglia system, and by doing so, it also has some, it also has some role in maintaining movements of the eyes, posture, and muscle tone, but it's also involved in inhibiting unwanted movement. Now the nucleus accumbens. So the nucleus accumbens is subcortical structure. You can see it's somewhere here deep. It's somehow associated with this caudate, the caudate nucleus, somehow associated with the caudate nucleus, and it's often not seen in most of the section through the brain. It is the pressure center of the brain, the pressure center of the brain. It is that, you know that kind of feeling that you have when you receive an award. You can remember when was the last time you received something from your friend. Still remember that feeling that you had, the feeling that you have when you receive an award or receive a present or a gift. The pressure center of the brain, the pressure center of the brain. It's also now linked in motivation and reward. And I always give an example of, our children, for example, they behave the way they behave because of reward and punishment. Reward and punishment. For example, if the boy is doing something that is not wanted or something which is immoral, we can punish them, and by doing so they learn through that kind of punishment that they get. So it makes the part of, it contribute to behavior. And then, for example, also, if someone at this, if our children now they doing something that is, is to be appreciated. For example, if the boy solves something which is very tactical, and maybe he's just 5 years old or 2 years old, and then we prize him, and we kind of motivate him to do, and that forms one of the reward system. It is associated in habitual behavior alongside the dorsal striatum. The dorsal striatum. So subthalamic nucleus, as the name suggests, it is subthalamic. It is below the thalamus. So this is the thalamus, and this is below the thalamus. That's why you call it the subthalamic nucleus. The subthalamic nucleus is important in the indirect pathway, and I know you don't know anything about indirect pathway, but we're going to discuss it shortly. But one among its function is to excite the internal segment of the globus pallidus, the internal segment of the globus pallidus. Don't worry about all these functions, because we're going to see these pathways shortly. This is just a summary on the function of the this nuclei. So striatum, which forms the putamen caudate, is main input to the basal ganglia. Is the main input to the basal ganglia. The globus pallidus, the internal segment of globus pallidus will be, its most important output gate, together with substantia nigra pars reticulata. But substantia nigra pars compacta, it's important in releasing dopamine, which facilitates movement. And then subthalamic nucleus is a key in indirect pathway, and nucleus accumbens in motivation and goal-directed behavior.